everybody. Welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed, the live television edition. It is July 13th, 2013. Coming to you from the MPTS
It's July 17th.
studio. What did I say?
13th.
Oh,
and
July
you
13th.
just asked me like 10 seconds
I know,
ago.
yeah. It's
too.
July 17th, 2013. And we're coming to you from the MPTS studio in Manchester, New Hampshire. Glorious downtown Manchester, New Hampshire on a very hot day. So if you're watching us on Local 23 in Manchester, welcome. Or if you're watching us online at ipmnation.com. Of course, we're also now in Cambridge and in Salem, Massachusetts, and in Nashville soon, I believe.
I hope so.
Yeah, so
I hope so.
We're spreading the virus. This is Little Mel, of course, from ipmnation.com. She's our marketing minion, and she also hosts No Boundaries Monday nights at 10:30 p.m. Eastern on ipmnation.com. And we have a couple of guests who are supposed to be here, and neither of them have arrived yet, so they're both late. I won't say who they are. That way, if they don't make it, I don't want to embarrass them for not showing up. But I will give you a hint. They've both been on before, multiple times actually. So that's all I'll say. So, but they're probably stuck in traffic or something. You texted one of them. Did he respond?
Not yet.
And
well, maybe because one of them went zip-lining on Sunday.
Oh, really?
So maybe he thinks that he can travel by zip line, and maybe he's trying to travel here by zip line.
Well, that could be. Unless something happened while ziplining. I hope nothing happened.
Maybe
to
we'll
him.
see him through the streets of Manchester on a little zip line, just
Perhaps.
zipping through.
That would be exciting. If anyone wants to join the show, join the conversation, if you're watching us live, of course, the number is on the screen. Feel free to call. You can also text at 603-344-6491 if you're too shy to call. Or, of course, we do have the chat room. If you go to ipmnation.com/MCUTV, you can chat with us in the chat room if you have something to say or a question or anything during the show, and you're too shy to call or text. There is that option as well.
What if they want to insult us?
That's fine. I can take insults. I always say, let them say what they want as long as they spell my name right. So our guests aren't here, but as always, there's always plenty to talk about. And I happen to see this show up on, this is from HuffingtonPost.com, which many of you know is a favorite website of mine. And a former president, Jimmy Carter, has said something interesting. I find it interesting because it's regarding a subject that I discuss at length quite a bit on the show. And I often become unleashed about this. And to some of you, you've heard me say all this before, but I'll try to be relatively brief. I'll make this kind of a quick mini rant for the uninitiated, because we do have we've been picking up a lot of new viewers and listeners and so forth. But when you elect people to send to Washington, D.C., we like to sort of toil under this delusion that those people for whom you vote, you're voting for someone to represent you and your interests and your values and your positions on the various issues and all that stuff. Someone who you hope will have some integrity and some honesty, etc. And again, I want to stress, I'm not talking about at the state level, I'm not talking about locally, I'm talking about federally. When you vote to send someone to Washington, D.C., to represent you, to be there on your behalf. Of course, that's all a fallacy. It's all an illusion. Our government, our federal government, is based on a system of legalized bribery. I said for years, and I heard Jesse Ventura say the same thing, and I loved hearing him say it because Jesse's kind of a hero of mine, but he said that in Washington they should have to wear NASCAR suits with the patches all over them of everyone who owns them, who donates to their campaigns. Because the reality is you're not really voting for someone to represent you. You're voting for, literally, this is the truth, you're voting for whatever set of special interest groups, lobbyists, corporations, the banks, Wall Street, because they own everybody. That's who you're really voting for. What set of special interests do you want represented in Washington? And you probably don't want any of them represented in Washington, but unless you know who owns the particular candidate you're voting for, you don't even know what special interests and corporations and lobbyists and whomever you're supporting. Of course, if you're actually in Washington or have ever been in Washington as a public servant, You don't admit this, obviously. Most of America doesn't admit this. Most people are willfully blind to how our federal government actually operates. And what's funny about it, too, is you also have the conspiracy theorists who actually aren't completely wrong. I mean, they take it to an extreme. A lot of them. Well, I mean, there's varying degrees of conspiracy theory. You know, there's the extreme that, you know, 9/11 was an inside job and that the world
Holocaust didn't happen.
Well, that's more of a Islamic thing. Like Ahmadinejad, formerly the leader of Iran, used to say things like that. But I suppose there are conspiracy theorists who believe that. But they tend to believe that the extreme ones tend to believe that absolutely nothing ever happens unintentionally. If there's an oil spill, like Alex Jones, he's kind of the king of conspiracy theorists, you know. And some of you may be familiar with Alex Jones. I like Alex Jones. I mean, I don't think he even believes his own BS, but I think he's very, very good at what he does, and I respect him in that regard. You know, but anytime there's an oil spill or anything like that, he says, oh, the government's behind it. It's a false flag operation. Some of the conspiracy theorists, again, these are the extreme ones. You know, they think Newtown was a setup orchestrated by the government, that those weren't really parents that were crying on camera. Those were actors. I mean, that's what some of these people really believe. And that the world is really run by these shadowy secret organizations called the Illuminati or
Lizard people,
yeah, reptilian shapeshifters. Again, that's the extreme, and I'm talking about the extreme of that sort of perception of how the world really works. Of course, there's all kinds of different levels of that, variations of that. There are people who are conspiracy theorists who don't believe the extreme crazy stuff, but do believe some of it. I mean, I know a lot of people who generally don't buy into any conspiracy theories, except for, of course, what's sort of become the granddaddy of them all, the 9/11 conspiracy, that was really an inside job. A lot of people who have nothing else to do with any conspiracies buy into that one.
I dated a Holocaust conspiracy theorist.
Did you?
Yeah.
That must have been scary.
It was like he like legit like worshipped Hitler, and he thought the Holocaust was like a big hoax, and there are people that think that way.
Oh, there are. Absolutely, absolutely.
Which is bizarre to me.
But my point about the conspiracy theorists is that they're not completely wrong in the idea that there are forces that control our government that we don't necessarily vote for and support. It's not really these forces that are unseen. They think they're unseen forces like the Illuminati or whoever, or aliens, or whatever the hell these people think. It's not that. The forces that really control our government operate in plain sight. They're the corporations and the special interest groups and lobbyists and all that. That's who really runs things. Both parties, by the way. This is one of the reasons why I'm an independent. I don't believe in either party because, again, I'm speaking federally, but at the federal level, they're both completely bought and paid for, sometimes by the same people. Dirty little secret a lot of people don't realize is that in some cases, literally the same people will own both candidates in a particular race. I forgot to mute my phone. I might, yeah. Actually, Mel just texted me. You could have said that.
I don't want to interrupt you. You were on leash.
Quite all right. I have something special that I'm glad you reminded me of that we may do.
You're welcome.
Having to do with Steve Valancourt, one of my favorite subjects. We may do that. We may not. It depends. It depends on if one of our guests is here, because one of the guests who is supposed to be here, who is late, is a friend of Steve's. So I don't want to dishonor our guests. So I may save the email or I may read it. We'll see what happens. But the forces that really run things are not unseen. They operate in the open, and they will very often donate to both parties. The NRA, for example, there's this conception that the NRA owns the Republican Party, which they do. And that the reason that, and again, this is kind of a caricature of how it really works, but a lot of people, particularly people who are very paranoid that, Obama and the Democrats and the UN, they're going to send in the black helicopters and they're going to take away everyone's guns, there's a perception that it's very much a binary left versus right kind of thing. The reality is the NRA also owns a lot of Democrats. And that's one of the reasons why this sort of nightmare scenario that the folks, and I'm very pro-Second Amendment myself. I don't want to take away anyone's gun. I mean, I live in New Hampshire. We're armed to the teeth in New Hampshire. This is also one of the safest states in the country. So I have no problem with guns. But the NRA also owns a huge chunk of the Democratic Party. We were talking last week. John Burt was our guest, the Honorable John Burt, very conservative guy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. And we were talking about, he used to live in Vermont when Howard Dean was governor of Vermont. And the NRA, Howard Dean is viewed as this, we were talking about this, how he's viewed as this very left-wing, very liberal Democrat. But the reality is, Howard Dean, very pro-Second Amendment. And the NRA endorsed Howard Dean when he was governor of Vermont. And he's a Democrat. And by endorsed, of course, also, I'm sure a large campaign contribution was included in that. I'm sure they own him. But there's a lot of Democrats that they own. Harry Reid, of course, of Nevada. They own him. That's another reason why nothing was ever going to happen in terms of this recent gun legislation in Congress. And I kept telling, some of my very conservative Republican friends, look, you're worried about nothing. This is not going to pass because you have a lot of Democrats who are going to vote against it, like Harry Reid. Harry Reid, who a week or two before the last big vote that they had on this, I saw on television actually saying complimentary things about Wayne LaPierre of the NRA. And Harry Reid is a Democrat. So, but very often, too, even in a particular, just a fictional Senate race. Just imagine you have a Republican and a Democrat running against each other for a U.S. Senate seat. Very often, and people don't know this because they keep it well hidden, if it's a close race, you might have a corporation or a special interest actually donate to both candidates. And that sounds counterintuitive. Well, why would they do that? Why would someone donate to a Republican and a Democrat running against each other for the same seat? That doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they just choose one or the other? The reason is they hedge their bets. And this happens more than you might think. But they hedge their bets. If it's a close race, a lot of these big money contributors will do that because they want to make sure whoever wins, they own them. They want to make sure that whoever wins is in their pocket. So if they're not sure, very often they'll donate to both sides at the same time. It happens a lot. And the point being that, the conspiracy theorists, they're not completely crazy. The people we elect really don't work for us. But if you're in Washington or have ever been in Washington, you're not supposed to acknowledge any of this. And like I say, most of the country's citizenry and voters are willfully blind to all of this. I don't know why. To me, it all seems perfectly obvious. I think I'm a reasonably intelligent guy. I don't think I'm a genius or anything. And yet, to me, this is really, really obvious. I can't believe I'm the only one who's figured this out. And I'm not the only one who's figured this out.
So are you saying if you went to Washington, you wouldn't be representing me, you'd be representing whoever represents you?
Yeah, I'd be representing whoever wrote the check. That's how it works. How do you think I get there?
Well, maybe it would be something awesome. Maybe you'd be, represented by, people that make apple pie or something.
And those people would have to fund my campaign. Because it takes a lot of money to run for office. You can solve this by taking the money out of the process, but that'll never happen.
Is that why you don't run for office? Because it takes a lot of money?
It does take a lot of money. I don't have a lot of money. Now, if anyone wants to write me a big check, I'll run. I'll lose. I'm unelectable. Jimmy Carter said something about this. Now, the reason this is significant, and the headline on this is Jimmy Carter, unchecked political contributions are legal bribery. There are reasons why this is significant that Jimmy Carter is saying this, and I know, at least half the audience right now is already just tuning out because conservative Republicans have this incredible bias against Jimmy Carter, say that he was the worst president ever and whatnot. I think he was. As an independent, I'm not carrying his water. I don't think he was a very effective president either. But I wouldn't say he was the worst. I would say that George W. Bush is the worst. That's my personal opinion. Carter's done a lot of very positive things in his post-presidency, and I think has redeemed himself in the eyes of many people. But to hear a former Washington insider use that phrase what did he call it? Legal bribery. The same wording that I often use. I say that all the time. Our federal government is based on a system of legalized bribery. That is very significant. That he used that phrase is significant, and that he is, look, you don't get any more Washington insider than the president, a former president of the United States, a former leader of the free world, acknowledging that this is how it really works. No one else ever says that. No, nobody. I'll read this to you quickly. Again, this is from Huffington Post. The author is Ray Henry. I'll read this quickly. Dateline Atlanta. Former President Jimmy Carter said Wednesday that unchecked political contributions are, quote, legal bribery of candidates, unquote, and denounced a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that made possible unlimited spending by outside groups, including corporations and labor unions. That's referring, of course, to the Citizens United decision, you know, the money is speech thing, which is a nightmare. Carter said during a speech in Atlanta, quote, it's accepted fact, it's legal bribery of candidates, and that repayment may be in the form of an ambassadorship to someone who has raised $300,000 or $400,000 to help a candidate get elected, unquote. Carter spoke at a forum where an agency of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe released its report on last year's U.S. election. The U.S. government invited the European agency to observe the process. He said the U.S. Supreme Court made a very stupid decision by removing limits on independent campaign spending by businesses and labor unions. I apologize, it's extremely dry in here. Which the court found was a constitutionally protected form of political speech. Again, it's the money is speech thing. The Democrats said that he and his Republican opponents used public financing to run their general election campaigns in 1976 and 1980. In other words, when he ran against Reagan in 1980 and Ford in 76, it was transparent. It was open. You knew, because our government, and this is something we'll get to with the Snowden thing, our government should be transparent. We, the people, we should know what our government's doing. But also, the campaigns should be transparent. The election process should be transparent. You should be able to go to a website and see exactly who has donated how much money to whom, so that you know who owns them. This should all be public knowledge. It should all be completely published and exposed.
Didn't, during one of the Obama elections, didn't he have some, transparency website or something?
The Obama administration likes to throw that word around, transparency, and talk about being a transparent administration. But it's all talk. It's all BS. They don't mean any of it.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. During the initial stimulus package that they pushed through, Obama said, again, this is going back to the beginning of his first term, that there will be a website. This is the kind of transparency he offered.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking
yes,
of.
There will be a website that you can go to track every penny of stimulus money that is being spent, so that you, the people, will know exactly where all that money is going to. Have you ever been to that website?
No.
No. You know why? Because it doesn't exist. And I knew there would be no website. Of course there's no website. I mean, it's, my BS meter redlined when he said that. Carter more generally criticized the amount of private contributions flowing into political campaigns. He said, quote, I would say that it's almost impossible for a candidate, like I was back in those early days, or others even, to be considered seriously as a candidate to represent the Democratic or Republican parties as nominee if you can't raise $100 million or $200 million from contributors, many of whom know that they are making an investment in how they are going to be treated by the winner after the election is over, unquote. Carter said that while the elections in the United States once set an example for the world, the country's reputation diminished in 2000 when the U.S. Supreme Court intervened in a Florida vote recount, effectively deciding the election in favor of Republican George W. Bush. He also criticized GOP-led state legislatures for changing polling hours in ways that Carter said were meant to frustrate likely Democratic voters, which they did, and there's some very egregious examples of that. The OSCE report found that the following points. The 2012 election was administered professionally and the public generally viewed the outcome as legitimate. Voter identification rules vary across the states and have become politicized. Yes, they have. Political spending by outside groups can be exempt from disclosure requirements, raising transparency concerns. Rules on vote recounts vary widely and are not always clearly defined, which could result in complaints. That's the end of the article. So, very significant to have a former president of the United States coming out and saying, yeah, this is how it works. It's legal bribery. So I agree with Jimmy Carter on that. Our guests, neither of our guests are here. I'm going to try to find the email very quickly that Mel was talking about. We had, his name comes up a lot on this show, even though I've never actually met him. Steve Valancourt, who used to host a show here on MPTS called Steve's Liberty Express. He's a New Hampshire state legislator. He achieved some brief national infamy when his Sieg Heil moment.
Wow, I email you a lot.
Yeah, and I think this might be...
It's almost like I work a lot with you.
On my other...
I sent it to the Matt one.
My other account.
Yeah.
Okay. We have been trying to get Steve Valancourt to come on the show. His name comes up a lot because even though I've never actually met him, there's the story, and I'm not going to repeat the whole story because I've told it 1,000 times. So if you're new to the show, go back and check a previous episode. You're bound to.
I just got a text from John, by the way.
Yes?
He says he just got back into town, so sorry.
Okay, so he's not going to be here?
Looks like that's what he's saying, yeah.
I think it's probably safe to assume at this point, at 23 past the hour, that neither of our guests are going to make it. So John Heichel was supposed to be here with us, but he's a very busy man, and that's all right. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, Tony Soltani was our other guest, but I don't know why he's not here. So anyway, so Steve's name comes up a lot on the show. I often tell the story of a couple of years ago at the Amsterdam Christmas special. The short version of the story is Steve Valancourt, who is no fan of Amsterdam, Wednesday nights at 11, when he was leaving the building, attempted to lock us out of the building while there were several of us outside waiting to go up to do the Amsterdam Christmas special. I won't get into the whole story again, but and of course, like I said, he got some national fame with saying Sieg Heil to Bill O'Brien, at that time the Speaker of the House in the New Hampshire State Legislature, during that little dust-up. And, of course, we had on the show recently Ross Terrio, who spoke about his lawsuit against Steve Valancourt, which they ended up settling. But Ross was suing, and this relates to the email, Ross was suing Steve Valancourt for defamation of character. Because when Steve used to do his show here at MPTS called Steve's Liberty Express, it had to do, I won't get into the weeds on what it was about, but it had to do with redistricting. And Steve didn't like the way, some of the folks who voted on that didn't like the way they voted. And one of them was Ross Terrio, saying that Ross voted the way opposite that he pledged to vote or something like that, when in fact Ross wasn't even there. So Ross not being there, and then Steve repeatedly, over the course of several episodes of his show, claiming that he was there and calling him a snake and a weasel and all that, that drove Ross to eventually sue Steve Valancourt for defamation of character. And they ended up settling. In fact, when Ross was here on the show, we discussed that perhaps the real reason that Steve Valancourt gave up his show was he did not want to have to be forced to apologize on the air to Ross Terrio. Part of the final agreement in the arbitration between them when they settled the lawsuit was that Steve agreed to apologize and admit that he was wrong in print, which he did. But we were kind of speculating because why else would Steve give up his show? Because anybody who is familiar with Steve Valancourt knows this is a guy who clearly loves attention. So why would he give up his television show if he loves attention? And So we were thinking that maybe he just didn't want to have to admit on the air that he was wrong. So he, and apparently, now my understanding is Mel does the booking. She books the guests on both this and the radio edition of the show. And my understanding is that Steve told you that he had made a resolution to go 1 calendar year without doing any television. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, he told Gary, and Gary told me that was his resolution was to not do any television. I think, like, the one stipulation was, like, unless it really greatly benefited him.
Well, what could benefit him more than being a guest on Matt Connarton
right?
Unleashed and getting the MCU bump?
Doesn't know what he's missing.
I know. So Gary initiated the Gary Hopper, of course, from Rock Paper Hand Grenades, initiated the contact with Steve, and that's what Steve told Gary.
Yes. Well, okay. I had contacted Steve, and then I started talking to Gary, and Gary, like, offered his help and was like, I'll talk to Steve and I'll tell him that, like, I'll come on with him if that makes him feel more comfortable. And that's when I learned about the whole, like, New Year's resolution, which I'm wondering if it was actually a resolution or if it had something to do with the lawsuit that he didn't want to do any TV.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I really do. So you had made a one last attempt.
Yes.
To email Steve Valancourt to invite him to come on, because I'm fascinated by the guy. He's such a weird dude. And I know that I do agree with him on some issues. I'm now going to read to you Steve's response to Mel's email to him most recently on July 10th. This is dated July 10th. Mel wrote to Steve saying, please come on the show. Matt's not interested. Anyone who knows me knows I don't ambush guests, even if I disagree with them. I like, part of the point of doing a show like this for me is I like talking to people about things I disagree with them because I want to hear their side and I want to have a dialogue and have a conversation. I don't ambush guests. I don't attack I attack people, but not to their faces. Anyway, so this is Steve's response to Mel. Her very sincere, and it was sincere. I really want Steve to come on the show. Her very sincere invitation to join me on Matt Connarton Unleashed for an hour. This is what he said. I certainly would never be afraid of being ambushed by anyone. Trust me. I can defend myself if the need arises, which I believe. I believe I told you before that I made a New Year's resolution to avoid TV for the year. One I've managed to keep, except for maybe a snippet here and there beyond my control. Now that we're into July, I might be willing to relent just a bit. This is where it gets interesting. I have no interest, however, in talking about anything vile people like Ross Terrio have talked about. So while I was going to say yes, I guess the answer is still no. Any show that would waste people's time talking about such a silly matter is not one I care to do. Sorry, you had me until you mentioned that. Even if I do TV, it will only be with people I respect. I respect no one who deigns to give the likes of Terrio, Manchester's biggest loser, even 1 second of airtime, with 2 exclamation points at the end of that.
What's that word? D something?
Deign.
What's that mean?
It means that it's not something he would do. He does not want to do that. Or I'm sorry, who decides? In this case, we deigned to give Ross airtime, so we decided to have him on. So apparently, Steve Valancourt does not respect this show or me because we had on the vile Terrio. The vile Terrio is how he talks about him like he's a supervillain.
It's funny because I'll have to look it up, but I shared the email with Ross, and
did you?
He messaged me back, and he's like, "Hey, thanks, that was a laugh." And then he was like, "Tell Steve that I said this," and I'll have to go look it up to see what he said.
Yeah. So so I guess the long and short of it is that Steve Valancourt will not be coming.
He couldn't just say. He had to, like, add in that he was going to say yes.
I'm surprised he just didn't write back Sieg Heil or something. Or Wiener Schnitzel or some other German word. So, I'm bummed our guests aren't here because I wanted to ask John Heichel specifically about the Edward Snowden thing. Maybe we'll come back to that. Here's something interesting. Yeah, we might come back to that in a minute. I want to talk about Liz Cheney, because this surprised me. Liz Cheney, Wyoming Senate run echoes GOP divisions. This is also from Huffington Post. Something that I'm fascinated by is the modern Republican Party in 2013. It's something I ask my guests about, those who are Republicans. The different factions and subdivisions within the party. It's very interesting to me. Gary on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades, the show that we do Wednesdays at 6 p.m., he has talked about that on that show, about how in New Hampshire, specifically, you've got the conservative Republicans like himself, and then you've got the Free Staters or the Libertarians who come in from other states, and they're trying to spread their libertarianism throughout the country. The Free State movement, if you're not familiar with it, it's actually pretty interesting. I suggest you look it up. There's Free Staters, I believe, in every state of the country. These organizations where they're trying to, they're trying to infiltrate the governments, the state governments in every state, with their free state libertarian philosophy, and trying to kind of state by state turn the country libertarian. It's interesting. Gary's kind of critical of the libertarians because they come in and they portray themselves, shall we say, as Republicans, but they're actually libertarians, because it's very hard for any kind of third party to really, to get elected. That's one of the reasons I'm unelectable, because I'm not a member of either party. That's one of the reasons. This show might also be a reason. But so you've got different factions, and of course you've got the Tea Partiers, who cause a lot of trouble, I think, for the Republicans. You've got the mainstream moderate Republicans, who of course are not fond of the Tea Partiers, because the Tea Partiers, they talk about, obviously they're very concerned about taxes, and they want to keep taxes low. In a lot of ways, the Tea Partiers are similar to libertarians in the sense that they want a small government, very limited taxation. Limited government, limited taxation. Of course, where the Tea Partiers show themselves to be very different from libertarians is when you get Tea Partiers talking about social issues like gay marriage or abortion in particular. Because when you get Tea Party or talking about an issue like abortion, you have a guy like Todd Aiken saying things like, using phrases like legitimate rape, or Richard Murdoch saying things like, it's God's plan if a woman's raped and gets pregnant, and things like that. So
I don't mean to interrupt, but
yes.
I just found Ross's reply, if you want me to read it.
Oh, absolutely. Let's hear it. Yes. So Ross Terrios, this is his reply to the email that I read from Steve Valancourt.
He says, "Thanks, little Mel. That cheered me up. Tell him I said there is nothing more pathetic than a miserable old queen who is going to die alone. That might get him to come on the show."
Wow.
That might get him to come on the show.
Well, there you have it, Steve Valancourt. If you're watching, consider this. We're going to re-invite you one more time. This is a new invitation, a new olive branch, if you will. Please come on the show and respond to Ross Terrio calling him what, a bitter old queen?
There is nothing more pathetic than than a miserable old queen who is going to die alone.
And Steve, look, I mean, we're more than happy to have a miserable old queen who is going to die alone come on to the show. We have all kinds of people on the show. Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians,
miserable old
queens who are going to die alone. All kinds of people come on Matt Connarton Unleashed, and we don't ambush anyone. So please join us. I'd love to get the perspective and worldview of a miserable old queen who's going to die alone. I don't know what kind of ideology that constitutes. I don't know. I
wonder who represents them in Washington.
I don't know. I don't know if there's a miserable old queen who's going to die alone lobby or a special interest group in Washington, D.C., but that could be a good niche for the Honorable Steve Valancourt. So there you have it, Ross Terrio's reply, the vile Terrio, as
Manchester's
as
biggest loser.
Yes, Manchester's biggest loser, as Valancourt describes him. It's too bad. I'd love to have both of them on. And maybe we could I'd like to have both of them on for some sort of debate, and we could have like their names on the screen. Of course, under Ross it would say Ross Terrio, and under Steve it could say miserable old queen who's going to die alone. That'd be wonderful. That'd be great. Ross is great. Ross is very funny. I like Ross a lot. We should have Ross on again soon.
Should.
Anyway, so there's a lot of division in the modern Republican Party, both in New Hampshire and nationally, and there's been some backlash against the Tea Partiers because, they're just embarrassing. Anyway, so this is Liz Cheney apparently has decided to run. Let me read this to you because this has to do with some of the dialogue that the Republican Party is having with itself nationally right now as a party. Liz Cheney says her GOP primary challenge to Wyoming's senior U.S. Senator is about sending a new generation to Washington, but it has all the hallmarks of the same divisions that have roiled the Republican Party nationally for years. While he's no moderate, incumbent Senator Mike Enzi has shown he is willing to compromise occasionally with Democrats, such as when he supported a sales tax on internet purchases, which is another reason I want to talk about this. But we have a call. Maybe this is a miserable old queen who's going to die alone, calling to respond to the vile Terrio. Hi, welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed. Who's on the line?
Hi.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. What's up?
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Well, that was wonderful. I'm going to have a nice day. I'm glad that person called.
That was a deep conversation.
That was a deep conversation.
I'm very moved by it.
I was
spiritually,
Yeah.
and I'm a changed person now.
I see everything. I see everything differently now. I was
Thank you.
My original
caller.
plan was to have a horrible day, but she kind of made me rethink things. All right, let me read this last paragraph again because this is important. While he's no moderate, incumbent Senator Mike Enzi has shown he is willing to compromise occasionally with Democrats, such as when he supported a sales tax on internet purchases. That's the Marketplace Fairness Act, and regular viewers of this show know exactly how I feel about that. But Cheney, the elder daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, suggests that such compromise isn't good enough for a true conservative. She says, quote, "I'm running because I'm concerned about the direction of the nation. I think it's time for us to say to ourselves, can we continue to get along in Washington?" Unquote. Well, now, I will read the rest of this to you, but a couple of things. First of all, she's the daughter of Dick Cheney, which means her talking about a new generation makes me suspicious because she's not some new face on the scene. She's the daughter of Dick Cheney. I don't think she's going to usher in a new wave of whatever the hell it is that she's trying to do. And the other thing, though, I do like that she's hitting Mike Enzi on his support for the Marketplace Fairness Act. Now, I don't want to go into a whole big rant about that again, but just really quickly, for those who don't know, and if you're a regular viewer of the show, you do know, because I talk about it all the time, but this gets buried in the news by everything else going on, by Snowden and everything else. The Marketplace Fairness Act is basically an internet sales tax. And if it becomes law, the federal government will then make it allowable for state governments to charge state sales taxes on internet sales purchases. It is a nightmare scenario for all kinds of reasons, and a large portion of Republicans. This is not a partisan issue, believe it or not. When I first learned about it, I assumed, this is the Democrats, because Democrats love taxes. Republicans are the firewall against new taxes. Mm-hmm. Not in this case. In this case, both parties are split. You have Democrats that are both for and against the Marketplace Fairness Act, and you have Republicans that are both for and against the Marketplace Fairness Act. A lot of Republicans are supporting this, like Mike Enzi. They're getting around it by saying, well, if the state already has an existing sales tax, this is just expanding the parameters of how we as a state collect it. We'll just expand the parameters to include internet commerce. So it's not really a new tax. Of course, it is a new tax. They're full of crap. But their owners, the brick and mortar lobbyists, the Walmarts of the world, who own these people, don't want, well, they do want an internet sales tax because they don't want internet commerce to flourish. So they own people like Mike Enzi. So even though he's a Republican, he should be a no new tax guy, but he supports the internet sales tax.
Did you ever check out that website I sent you?
I did, yes. I looked at it briefly. So I like that she's hitting him on that. But I'm skeptical. See, this thing about, what does she say here? She talks about him occasionally compromising with Democrats, and that a conservative shouldn't do that. Well, first of all, one of the reasons we have all this inertia in Washington, and we have these crisis scenarios that pop up, particularly in cases like when it's time to raise the debt ceiling, which is important to do, by the way. A lot of Republicans don't understand that voting to raise the debt ceiling is not the same thing as voting to increase spending. Voting to raise the debt ceiling is simply saying that we're going to follow through on paying our debts that we've already incurred, and to not raise the debt ceiling is default. And that would mean that for the first time, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, for the first time in the history of the United States government would say we now default on our credit, which would be calamitous for the U.S. economy. A lot of Republicans don't get that. It's frustrating to me. But we get into this gridlock when it's time to do critical things like that because there is no compromise in Washington. Republicans in Washington, moderate, or what we now call mainstream Republicans like John Boehner, are terrified of the Tea Partiers. Terrified of them. So there is no compromise. So for her to say, well, Mike Enzi occasionally compromised with Democrats and that's wrong, so we have to have absolute gridlock all the time on absolutely everything? I mean, that's stupid. Let's see. Several Republican senators elsewhere have faced Tea Party challengers questioning their conservative credentials as Cheney is. In Indiana, six-term Senator Richard Lugar lost in a Republican primary last year to Richard Murdoch, who went on to lose to Democrat John Donnelly. Now see, recent history. Richard Murdoch was the guy who said at a debate, with cameras rolling, well, if a woman is raped and she gets pregnant, well, that's just part of God's plan. That's the guy who Republicans in that state voted for in the primary to oust long time, who had been there for decades, conservative Republican Richard Lugar, who was a conservative. It's not like he was some liberal on the fringes of the Republican Party. He was a conservative himself. But again, this is the ongoing conversation that's going on within the party, and we have a call. I hope this person also helps. We have a nice day.
I'm excited.
Nice. We'll keep that streak going, I hope. Hi, welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed. Who's on the line?
Hello?
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 Hi.
Hi. You're on the air. It's your time to shine. You got anything for us?
What?
Okay, never mind. So, let's see. In Utah, Tea Party favorite Senator Mike Lee ousted three-term incumbent Senator Bob Bennett in 2010, and Senator Orrin Hatch fended off a Tea Party challenger to win a seventh term last year. The winner of Wyoming's Republican primary just over a year from now will be a heavy favorite to win the general election. Registered Republicans outnumber Democrats in Wyoming by a margin of more than 3-1. Very conservative state. Wyoming hasn't had a Democrat in its congressional delegation since 1979, the year Dick Cheney succeeded retiring Democratic Representative, that's a name I'm not familiar with, Tino Roncalio, to take the state's lone U.S. House seat. Challenging any incumbent is a brazen move in Washington. At least until now, the state has shown considerable deference to those established in office. Liz Cheney describes herself as a Tea Party sympathizer. She called the movement favoring low taxes as a force for good in terms of getting people to focus on fiscal issues. Actually, if the Tea Party stuck to that, maybe they wouldn't be such an embarrassment. But again, it's when you get them talking about social issues where you go, oh, I'm sorry. Liz Cheney, age 46, is the older of Dick Cheney's 2 children, both daughters. Married with 5 children, so she's not the lesbian one. Married with 5 children, she was a resident of Virginia until recently. She and her husband bought a home last year in the posh northwest Wyoming community of Jackson Hole. You know what's funny about that is Jackson Hole doesn't sound like a posh community.
No.
It sounds like a trailer park. I live over at Jackson Hole. It must something about the word hole, I guess.
Maybe that last caller lives in Jackson Hole.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. If he calls back, I'll do like the Larry King thing, and I'll say, Jackson Hole, you're on the line. I don't know if Larry King, he retired recently, so someone's got to pick up the mantle. Asked why voters should oust Enzi, a powerful incumbent, in favor of a rookie, Liz Cheney said seniority isn't necessarily an attribute. She told the Associated Press, quote, I think that part of the problem in Washington today is seniority. I don't disagree. I think it's time for a new generation to come to the fore. I don't see seniority as a plus, frankly, unquote. Well, that I agree with her on. I actually think we should have term limits. Enzi announced he would seek re-election Tuesday, more than 6 months earlier in the political cycle than he has declared his bid in the past, so he feels threatened. Enzi said by email, quote, working behind the scenes. This is what I've been doing since I was elected, and this is what needs to be done, unquote. I assume by that he means what the Koch brothers tell him, because the Koch brothers own the Republican Party to a large degree. I'm not just knocking the Republicans, by the way. Democrats are owned, too, by people like George Soros. It's both parties. Just want to remind everyone, in case I don't, because I have been accused of picking on Republicans more than Democrats, but that's only because Republicans have people like, Richard Murdoch and Todd Akin running around in their party. It's hard not to pick on them more. He immediately won the endorsement of colleagues in the Senate, including the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Said committee chairman, Republican Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas, quote, our support will be there for Mike, unquote. The other 2 members of Washington's congressional delegation, both Republicans, came out quickly in support of Enzi. Senator John Barrasso and Representative Cynthia Lummis praised Enzi for his long service and knowledge of Wyoming issues. The race promises to be hard fought. Enzi has had few serious Democratic challengers, much less Republican ones, since he was first elected to the Senate in 1996. He remains well-liked around the Senate as an affable former shoe salesman and mayor of the coal mining city of Gillette. Enzi, age 69, takes pride in keeping a lower profile and remaining much less partisan than most of his colleagues. He often refers to the 80-20 rule, that opposing parties usually can agree on 80% of the details of any given issue as a model for Republicans and Democrats to work together. What's wrong with it? See, we live in such a binary, polarized political environment now that to a lot of people, any kind of working together, any kind of compromise, anything at all is giving in to the enemy. That's how a lot of people think now. He handily won re-election in 2008 with more than 75% of the vote. That's impressive. That's extremely impressive. Liz Cheney's interest in the seat has been an open secret for months, dating at least to her purchase last year of a home in Wilson, a community in Jackson Hole, listed for $1.9 million. She appeared on stage with her father at last year's state Republican Party convention. It was Dick Cheney's first public appearance since he underwent a heart transplant, and father and daughter have been working on a book together. Since then, Liz Cheney has made frequent appearances at county-level GOP events in virtually every corner of the state. She also has been in the national public eye as a Fox News political commentator. Wyoming political veteran Chris Rothfuss said Liz Cheney's candidacy might be a sign of the divisions that have roiled the National Republican Party for several years, as I was discussing, with GOP office holders being challenged from within their party if they are seen as too willing to compromise with Democrats. See, they're not getting it. The Republican Party doesn't get it when it comes to Latinos and Hispanics, whether on the issue of immigration, or when it comes to being open to compromise. This hard line attitude, it doesn't work. It's not helpful. It makes them appear to be purely obstructionist, out for their own party, and not out for the needs of the country. Rothfuss, a Democratic state lawmaker who lost NZ in 2008, said Liz Cheney's challenge reflects everything that's wrong with partisanship in national politics. He says, quote, I would also say that the reason that Liz Cheney is running out of Wyoming rather than what in effect would be her home state of Virginia is because we're basically seen as a much cheaper option in trying to obtain a Senate seat, unquote. But make no mistake, the Cheney family is well established in Wyoming, an important qualification for anybody seeking major office in the state. While Liz Cheney was born in Madison, Wisconsin, her announcement pointed out that the Cheney family has roots that go back more than 100 years in Wyoming. Liz Cheney holds a law degree from University of Chicago and has worked as a lawyer for the State Department and Agency for International Development. Yet, she said, Wyoming has always been where her heart is. Oh, that's nice.
Now, because Rachel Maddow did this story, and there was talk about how, I guess, like, Dick Cheney kind of did the same thing, too, when I think he moved to, like, Dallas or something, and they're calling him, like, I think the term's carpetbaggers.
Right.
And people are saying that in Wyoming that, they don't like when somebody comes in and they live there for, like, a week, and then all of a sudden they think they represent the whole entire state.
Yeah.
And that's what I had gathered from it.
Hillary Clinton also took a lot of flack when she moved to New York to become to run for, but I mean, it was obvious she was going to win when she ran for the U.S. Senate and became a U.S. Senator from New York. People regarded her as being from Arkansas, obviously. So, it was blatant careerism.
So there's nothing, like, if you run, there's nothing that says, like, you have to live in this state for this long in order to, like, represent it?
No, I don't think legally. I mean, I don't think it's like with colleges, like you have to have lived in that state for a certain amount of time to get the in-state rate. I don't think most states have anything like that legally. It may be unconstitutional to have something that says that you have to have been. Actually, no, the more that I think about it, I don't think that's true, because I think when Mitt Romney moved to, I believe it was from Michigan to Massachusetts to become governor of Massachusetts. And I think there was some question at the time about his eligibility as far as having been a legal resident there for enough time. So you might be right. Some states may have something like that. It doesn't sound like they have something like that in Washington, because something that doesn't seem to be here is any question as far as her eligibility. So, by the way, hello to Chris Rose, who is watching. He sent me a text. Hello, Chris. Chris, of course, one of the hosts of our Sunday night show, VE. I can't tell you what VE stands for at 2:53 p.m. in the afternoon on MPTS, but VE is the initials of the show.
Did he tell us to have a good day?
No, he sent me. He just sent me a little smiley face text, so letting me know he's watching. So maybe that was him who called. I don't know. So hi, Chris. VE, by the way, returns this coming Sunday. You can listen to that exclusively on IPMNation.com Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. One of our most popular shows on the site. And as we begin to wrap up, we should also mention, of course, Little Mel, the new #1 show on IPMNation.com. She has reclaimed the #1 spot on IPMNation.com. No Boundaries, Monday nights at 10:30 p.m. Eastern.
Yes.
And do you know what you have coming up this Monday?
Yeah, I am going to be talking with Chris Bell. He's been on your show before.
Yep.
He's a friend of mine, and we're going to be talking about misogyny in the geek and, like, nerd culture. So we'll talk a lot about the whole fake geek girl thing and all that jazz.
Now, misogyny, is that like what a massage therapist does?
Something like that.
Oh, okay.
Maybe.
I'm sorry, I'm not terribly bright.
It's okay. It's okay.
And don't forget the live radio edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed, Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern. Kind of like the television edition, except you don't actually get to see me.
Was that an improvement?
It depends on your point of view. I don't think it is, ladies. 11 p.m. Saturday nights, and do you know who my guest is this coming? Oh, Dreamer, right?
Yes.
We have Dreamer. This coming Saturday night on Matt Connarton Unleashed, the radio edition. Dreamer from a great band from Providence, Rhode Island. They'll be joining me on the show. We'll play some new tunes from that band. On the radio edition, we mix music with politics, while we pretty much just stick to politics on this version of the show. And who's my guest next week on this version of the show? Do you remember? Oh, that's okay if you're not sure offhand. I should have asked you before. She does all the booking for the show, so she knows. She's looking that up now. Don't forget to come back at 4 p.m.
Mark Vogel.
Mark Vogel will be joining me by phone here on the television edition next week. Mark is all the way in Texas, and he's a very conservative gentleman, and I think we're going to be talking about Mark does not believe in separation of church and state. Mark believes that we are a Christian nation, and will be calling to make his argument, basically. I've already interviewed him once on the radio edition, so really interested in talking to him again by telephone next week, all the way from Texas. We vehemently disagree, but he's a great guy, and I do enjoy talking to him. I'm a big separation of church and state guy, so...
As am I,
yeah,
except
but
I'm not a guy.
Right, yes. But he'll give me his best argument, I'm sure. So Mark Vogel will be here next week, and like I said, I'll be back at 4 p.m., with Norm on Norm and Friends. And at 6 p.m., I'm really excited about Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. We have a great guest at 6 p.m. I'm spacing on his name. But a libertarian who, well, he's a Republican, but he's very libertarian in his views. George Lambert, that's his name, will be joining us on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades at 6 p.m. So looking forward to that. So, and if you're watching us live on MPTS, Inside Story is next. And that will do it for this week's television edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed. Thanks, everybody. Talk at you next time.